A reading from the book of Genesis in chapter 32. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go. The day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. We will join in reading responsively from Psalm 121 as printed in the order of service. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come from?
My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth.
He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber.
He who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep.
The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand.
The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night.
The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life.
The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time on forevermore.
A reading from the Gospel according to Luke in chapter 18. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for the people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, 'Grant me justice against my opponent.' For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, 'Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?'" Listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches.
The year was 1966. The cold of the winter months of January had set in. So off went John Lennon and Ringo Starr. They weren't going to stay in the cold. They vacationed in tropical Tobago of Trinidad and Tobago. Meanwhile, Paul McCartney sat back in Britain. He was writing lyrics to a new song, the song you just sang. Before the scriptures were read, the lyrics were different than earlier Beatles hits that sang of romantic relationships. Often those songs used personal words like I, me, you. Love-struck teens could sing along as if singing of their own romantic lives. The songs were entitled things like Love Me Do or She Loves You. Yet this January, McCartney, experimented with a different sort of song. In this other type of song, the narrator sits far off, witnessing a scene. An older woman cleans up rice at a church after a wedding. Okay, we're gonna go back. Is this too loud? Okay, sorry. It sounds very loud. An older woman cleans up rice at a church after a wedding. A priest lacks a congregation. It's not the poppy ballad about love that teens had grown accustomed to from the Beatles. Instead, it is a character, Eleanor Rigby. She had just attended a wedding, yet she is a spinster. And that spinster went to church wearing a face that she keeps in a jar by the door. It's a striking image. She puts on a false face in order to go into church and lie. She was probably lonely, as the song sings, but she presents an untrue image of herself within the walls of the church, the very place that we hope to be honest about our struggles and who we are. As the lyrics go on, we meet the priest, Father Mackenzie. Father Mackenzie preaches to an empty church. No one listens, no one is saved. I have to admit, I took no small delight putting it right before the sermon so that all y'all would sing about how you don't listen to the pastor, and then I speak. The Beatles' lyrics reflect Christianity's decline in membership in Britain in the 1960s. The song raises important questions for us to answer. What is the point of this thing we call church? Does our worship have deep meaning? Does anyone listen? Is anyone changed by it? For Father Mackenzie, no one was present. No one was saved. 1 month after writing the lyrics to Eleanor Rigby, each of the 4 Beatles sat down for an interview with a journalist who worked for a London newspaper called the Evening Standard. And each Beatle had an article written about them, telling about the lifestyles of the rich and famous in this lifestyle series. The articles were published to no great fanfare in March in Britain. John Lennon was interviewed in his home in Kenwood. The journalist portrayed him as a restless youth looking for meaning in life. The series of 4 articles then made the rounds, and they made it across the Atlantic to the United States. The Detroit magazine carried the article in May. The New York Times magazine covered it. Newsweek carried it in July. With each republication, there was no controversy, no brouhaha. In these reprints, there was the same quote from John Lennon. He said, "Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink." I needn't argue about that. I'm right and I'll be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. That'll get him in trouble. I don't know which go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Lennon says Jesus was right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me, Lennon said. There had been no major outcry about this comment in Britain, nor even in the US initially, though it reflected the truth as church attendance dropped 20% from 1940 to 1970 in Britain. Lennon's conclusions were not controversial, but a statement of fact that Christianity was in fact declining. In fact, Lennon spoke a critique that I suspect some of us have uttered with Gandhi. I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. They are so unlike Christ. In late July, one more publication got hold of the same series of interviews to republish them. It was a magazine geared to left-leaning youth called Date Book. The magazine covered topics that were controversial in the 1960s, like interracial dating or the legalization of marijuana. The magazine's publisher knew how to create a media frenzy. The articles appear in an issue, and on the cover, John Lennon was there in luxurious yacht, looking off into the sunset, and a quote in bold print above him read, "I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity? The magazine's editor was stirring the pot. He sent copies of the magazine to the most vocal DJs at radio stations throughout the South, where Christianity was still very vibrant and the institutional church was still accustomed to its own strength and cultural influence, and the Southern church threw its weight around. The editor sent the magazine copies off right before the magazine hit the newsstand. 2 DJs in Birmingham, Alabama took the bait and picked up the stories. The DJs themselves weren't all that religious. They would remark later that they rarely go to church, but they knew what would rile up their radio audience. They read the quote and then proceeded to destroy a Beatles album on live radio. Soon, an unofficial poll of their audience revealed that 99% of their Christian audience in Birmingham disapproved of Lennon's remarks. Critiques of the Beatles were like red meat to the Southern Christian base. Even then, the story might have petered out if it weren't for a national journalist who happened to be driving through Birmingham. He turned on the radio in his car as he was driving, and he heard the 2 DJs remark that they were going to hold a burning of Beatles albums. The journalist quickly filed his story, and it appeared in the newspapers of Atlanta and New York Times. Word spread like wildfire, just as the Beatles were preparing to arrive in the United States for what would be their final tour. Around 40 stations refused to play their music. One radio station even hired a tree grinding machine and asked their Christian listeners to bring their albums for demolition. When the Beatles tour reached Memphis, Tennessee, the only city in the Deep South to host the tour, the city council attempted to stop their concert by voting against it. These Christians in the South seemed to say, "How dare anyone question Christianity?" They used their power and they attempted to silence others. Ultimately, the Beatles' concert was still held in Memphis, yet the Southern Christian church, accustomed to their own power, no one was to question it, so they thought. And so one preacher in the South, in Memphis, David Noble, planned a counter-rally. This preacher had written earlier such stimulating pamphlets as Communism, Hypnotism, and the Beatles. The pastor invited the youth of Memphis to attend his counter-rally during the Beatles' concert to show that these youth did in fact love Jesus more than the Beatles. The pastor did not take the time to listen to the stories of, say, Lennon himself. In Lennon's younger years, he had been taken to church by his Aunt Mimi. He had joined the church choir, he had gone through confirmation, and even went to a Bible study for older boys. And yet, through it all, perhaps like your own children who went through confirmation, he came to question what the point of church was. He later learned that his own Aunt Mimi had no faith, and in fact, she encouraged John Lennon to go to church, but then she herself did not go. What is the point of church? Had these American clergy listened deeply that they might hear Lennon's genuine critique as he reflected on his own religious experience within the Church of England, a critique we would all do well to hear. For what is the point of what we're doing here? Are we truly changed and encouraged to love others in our community radically? These Southern clergy swatted down the Beatles' genuine questions and flexed their muscles to show their own power in the culture wars of their own day. One radio station even played hourly condemnations of the Beatles. Death threats from Christians poured in. Anonymous letters written by people claiming to be Christian defenders of the faith threatened violence against the Beatles. Phone calls threatened death. What is the value of a church that threatened the lives of others merely for asking questions? Soon after Lennon arrived in the United States on their tour, he sat broken. He lowered his head into his hands and broke down crying. He was torn that he had said something that would cause his fellow bandmates to be in danger. Frustrated that he had been misunderstood, Lenin tried multiple times to explain himself to the American press. He had an attempt at an apology in Chicago soon after arriving in the United States on this tour. He said, "I'm not anti-God, anti-Christ, or anti-religion. I was not knocking it. I was not saying we are greater or better." Lenin was simply pointing to the fact that the church was in decline and was becoming empty. For what is the church's worth? As the concert tour through America continued, violent Christians who were members of the KKK in South Carolina were seen burning a Beatles album hung on a burning cross. The imperial wizard of the KKK, claiming to speak for Christianity, condemned the band for supporting civil rights. In the midst of this frenzy, the band held one big concert in the South, the one in Memphis. The band flew into Memphis and did not even sleep overnight in order to protect themselves from possible violence at the hands of Christians. As the concert was underway in Memphis, a firecracker was thrown on stage. It went off. The four members looked around to make sure everyone was safe, and when they were, they continued on singing until the end of the concert. These four young men dared ask questions of Christianity. Clergy from the South signaled to their parishioners that it was okay to resist even the very questioning of Christianity. These young men were simply asking questions. They remind us to welcome those who ask deep questions of our faith and our church. Do we really love radically as Jesus called us to? Is our church involved in transforming our community by loving others? George Harrison of the Beatles remarked about Christianity, "I think religion falls flat on its face. All this, love thy neighbor, but none of them are doing it. If Christianity is as good as they say it is, it should stand up to a bit of discussion." I suspect we have our own George Harrisons and John Lennons among us. They may even be our youth who have gone through confirmation at some point, who are no longer in worship with us. Those willing to ask those tough questions of our church. Do we welcome those who ask uncomfortable questions, wrestling with the point of church? Do we welcome our youth who call us to live in more radical ways to follow the gospel? The sacred story for today tells of a man named Jacob. Jacob sets out with his family to meet his brother Esau. The night before Jacob is to meet his brother Esau, Jacob crosses the Jabbok River with his family in the middle of the night. Then, all alone, he goes back over the river and returns to the place he had just come from. There, all alone, Jacob meets a mysterious person. Jacob strangely begins wrestling with that mysterious person, and the unknown man was not winning. So the man, this unknown man, struck Jacob in his hip. He pulled Jacob's leg out of its joint. And yet Jacob still would not let go, though he was limping in pain and his grip was tight. The mysterious man said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking," almost as if you cannot look at him when the sun rises. Jacob insists that he will not let go unless the being blesses him. And so this strange, mysterious man blessed Jacob. As the story continues, the narrator describes the place where this awe-filled event occurred. It is called in Hebrew, the face of God, because Jacob saw God face to face and wrestled with God's own self. Jacob would not let go until God blessed him. Truthfully, there are those in our midst, like those youth that I just described, who are wrestling with God. willing to ask those tough questions, for it is not easy to question God, to wonder what is the point of this church. For those who ask these questions are often given the side eye by the faithful. Yet those who question and wrestle with God, they are the very ones whom God blesses. They may wear the mark of questioning it in the form of a limp, yet they are blessed for asking those questions, for calling us to live out our calling to love one another deeply. So if you're wondering what is the point of all of this, if you, like John Lennon and George Harrison, wonder how those who claim to be Christians can be unloving to their neighbors, do not loosen your grip. Hold tight to the very thigh of God and ask those uncomfortable questions. For in your questions, you will make us better as a church, and you will call us in our wrestling with God to love one another truly. Amen.